This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Exvangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. In this episode, recorded on February 7th, I spoke with Laura Polk about the insurrection and the development of the Christian right. Laura is an educator and researcher guest on the show. Through this discussion, we dive into some of the relevant history that led us to our present political moment. In particular, Laura illuminates three pivotal events that happened in 1980 and led to the political developments over the past 40 years. Those events and many others helped set the stage for the rise of the religious right. It's a very interesting conversation, and I hope that it helps provide at least a bit more context into how we got here and how we can continue to resist and challenge the same tyranny of evangelical politicians and their allies. You can support Laura's work via Patreon. The link to her Patreon is in the show notes. You can also support my work via Substack at postevangelicalpost.substack.com. Other methods of support can be found at podcast.com. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. Thank you very much, Jake. All right, let's get into it. And welcome back to Exvangelical. My guest this week is Laura Polk. She is returning to the show. I spoke to her a while back in regards to her project, the No Shame Movement. And Laura is an educator and researcher. And we are going to be talking everything that's sort of happened since the insurrection on January 6th. Today's date when we're recording is February 7th. So it's been just over a month since all of that happened. Laura, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm really glad you're here. I'm really glad you reached out to talk. We've been sort of exchanging messages since everything that happened on January 6th. And I want to sort of open it up to get your thoughts on what we saw happen when the Capitol was stormed, the role of them and the Christian right in that, how you think it's been covered and what you think might be lacking, just because you've been putting a lot of thought and research into the Christian right. So what are your thoughts on the way in which the and everything leading up to it was framed by the media that was trying to make sense of what was happening?
It wasn't surprising. I think that there was kind of a rift, like there always is. There's the camp, this camp. It's very predictable. Where people develop a very short memory of American history and forget this is who we've been, who our country's been for a very long time. But yeah, nothing about the media coverage really surprised me. It seemed kind of predictable. Mm-hmm. I'm old enough to remember, other senseless, I'm putting quotes, acts of violence, which I feel like that sounds like something, a quote or a term that the media invented. Senseless act of violence. But I mean, I'm old. I remember 9/11, which, I stand out among all the other ones. But I remember Oklahoma City. I remember Columbine. I was in college then. I remember each time there's this kind of collective when these things happen, even though there are signs that point to these things being inevitable. I don't want to say that they're normalized.
Right.
But what struck me, and I know you're asking about the media, but what, again, was the evangelicals, because that was when I thought, man, if there's ever a time to listen to a group of folks, I think I really, the number of people who came forward, a lot of white evangelical or white folks who grew up in the evangelical community who came forward and said, who were joining the chorus, this is exactly who we are. And we know because we grew up in this world, we knew these people. And I did as well. I don't think I knew quite the Confederate flag waving people. If we did have white friends that had those, they hid them when we came over. But of course, I think I really appreciate it because that's when a lot of people, again, who grew up in Christian communities said, this rhetoric, these are things we've heard in the pulpit, we've heard in Sunday school, we've heard from our church leaders. This is not surprising to us at all. And I think that was the thing that struck me the most. I know, and I know for a lot of marginalized people, especially people of color and particularly Black folks, there was also that absence of surprise as well. Because again, we know this is exactly who we are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was interesting because, you had a group that really were just the epitome of insiders, who had written, like yourself and many other people had written and spoken about this to a great deal. And I think that's what struck me more than anything. As far as the insurrection itself, I will say at a quick side note, as a missionary kid who's lived in developing countries, there's also another fascinating aspect of how, because we're all well aware of how the media covers these kinds of things when they happen in Black and brown countries. And I think that also, again, unsurprisingly, struck me sort of the contrast between, how they looked at, how they looked at it in terms of how it's normalized. This isn't normal as far as it's normal over there, but it's not normal here. Not meaning to oversimplify it, but
right, yeah. But I think you're right on with that. There was this element of surprise within a lot of the media, at least things that aren't within the conservative media ecosystem, but like the Times or the Post being shocked and the sort of thing that was happening. Do you have any particular examples of the or things that reminded you of where you remember things being covered differently when it was in another country with predominantly Black and brown populations?
Well, I lived in West Africa, in Ghana. I always kind of had a joke, sort of running joke with friends. Ghana has actually had relatively peaceful transitions of power and stability since 1980. So they're not in the news very much for a reason. But I keep thinking of what happened in Cote d'Ivoire and Ivory Coast, with the incumbent refusing to concede, refusing to step down, and the violence that kind of broke out on both sides. And the media, I remember the media seemed to give a white hat and a black hat, like in the movies. Like the villain was the incumbent, and the hero who legitimately won. But I know from stories from folks who lived there, and just from local media reports, it was much more complicated than that. Violence that was happening around it. And it wasn't simple as, oh, this evil guy wants to hold on to power, and this guy is a legitimate leader who will lead everyone to freedom. I think those narratives seem to happen a lot in a lot of developing countries, and failing to see the complexities of the events that led up to these things, the role of colonialism and all of it, and really just overlooking the people themselves as being autonomous. Like they're again, just like with everything else, just with every other way that they're portrayed, they're kind of people. There's an author, I actually can never remember how to pronounce his name. This East African author who wrote Africa, as I keep thinking of that. And one of the things he says in the article was Africans are referred to as people, capital P, but people, not individuals. And I think that's thing. I think, again, the thing that struck me is there you'll see footage of people, of violence and things like that. Here in the US, we know names. We know, oh, so-and-so is a construction worker from Nebraska and has 2 kids, or like we know names, we know people's identities.
Right.
We know that they're autonomous beings, if that makes sense.
Right.
I think it also goes along with sort of whenever some kind of atrocity is committed by white people, one thing, especially Black people, we understand is people will always try to understand more. Well, what led them to do it? Why, they do something like this? Let's try to understand them. Black and brown people don't have that luxury. No one tries to understand us or see what made us tick. We're guilty. And I mean, and we saw that, with the visuals. We saw that the police officers escorting one of the women down the Capitol steps that had just stormed the Capitol.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess there was around at once, because I feel like for me, having grown up in that world and understanding that proclivity to violence that's always been there, and contrast it with what I've seen in how the media covers that everywhere else. The questions I've had to answer whenever I tell people where I live, and their mind, they automatically assume that I lived in a violent, war-torn country, where Ghana was peaceful. They have a democratically elected president. They have their issues like any other country, but there was always this contrast between and what I actually saw. So
yeah, those are such good points, especially what you mentioned about the way in which individual versus group is inverted to really favor, if the subject is white, lone wolf, like the myth of the lone wolf, they are the exception to the rule. Whereas for decades, the press has always made these assumptions about groups of people that are not white. To see that play out in where 5 people died and the Capitol building was stormed, and for it to be majority white, those things obviously come to the forefront, or should come to the forefront of the way in which they're covered and understood. That's a good point, and I think one that is overlooked too often.
And the thing I want to say too, just in terms of historic context, reading about the civil rights movement from this side when I was doing research on the Christian right in the 70s, it was fascinating to hear how Black people were portrayed, radicals, mobs, riots and things like that. And you cut to 2020, Senator Tom Cotton writes an op-ed in the New York Times using radicals, violent mobs. I mean, it was like, to say history is repeating itself, the phrases are repeating themselves. And it's fascinating because it's the same reaction in the 60s, and on into the 70s. It was Black people were fighting for their own humanity. And because of that, we were radicals and we were violent mobs. And now the Black Lives Matter movement, Black people are fighting for our humanity, and that makes us radicals and violent mobs. That sometimes, and I mean, I wasn't alive in the 60s, and I know my parents that a lot has changed. But at the same time, it's sort of the similarity is almost a bit depressing. If I dwell in it too much. Really, this notion that white people are the only ones that are allowed to have autonomy and safety. And I feel like within the evangelical movement, particularly, that is dialed up to, like, specifically, we conservative white Christians are the only ones who are allowed to have autonomy and allowed to be able to do what we want. They would never admit that, but that's basically what their movement is founded on.
Yeah, and you got right to the heart of it there, in that so much of what is even visible in the primary sources of a lot of these people that were key to the development of the Christian right. They often said those things explicitly or very thinly veiled that it was for the purpose of white Christian supremacy. It's not really making any sort of leaps. It's right there. One of the things that we've seen since the insurrection is a sort of increase of discussions of Christian nationalism and the role that that plays in all the things that we've seen over the last 4 years leading up to the storming of the Capitol. For me, I think that that's a little concerning because it creates a rhetorical target that moves it away from white evangelicals being culpable for creating an environment in which Christian nationalism was able to thrive and be encouraged. And as you said, is present going back to the 60s and even much earlier on. So you've been connecting and researching things relative to the formation of the Christian right. So let's talk a little bit about some of your research into that as well, and this sort of continuous presence within white Christian circles here in the United States for decades.
Yeah, well, when I was in grad school, sorry, I won't go. Don't worry, I won't go back that far. But when I was in graduate school about 12 years ago, as studying anthropology, that's when I realized that religion, and particularly American Christianity, was something that I wanted to study more. Mm-hmm. But I would say there were two actually that I'd seen that maybe sort of look at these in a different light. Samantha Bee had a short documentary where I learned about Paul Weyrich. It was a documentary on the origins of the pro-life movement, the anti-abortion movement, mm-hmm. and how it was really steeped in racism and opposition to school desegregation. There is Brown versus Board, and then that led to schools beginning to desegregate, which led to white people forming segregation academies or private schools. My home state where I'm at, Virginia, was definitely very much that movement. And so we had these segregation academies that were all white schools until the IRS decided to start cracking down on them and saying, hey, you need to stop your admission or we will revoke your tax exemption, exempt status. And then in the meantime, Paul Weyrich, who again, I believe looks like a Bond villain, Paul Weyrich, come to DC, years before bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to change the world, was trying to get this conservative movement going and was trying to figure out, trying to find people, could organize and form like this new right, what they was called the new Christian right. And so he finds out about all these outraged white people who start the school. Then he pops in. There's a fight against the IRS on one side with a lot of these schools, Bob Jones being at the front. Mm-hmm. And so the way I like to put it, Paul Weyrich popped up like a Microsoft Word. If you're old enough to remember Flippy.
I see you're trying to start a social movement.
Exactly. I can help you with that. And he finds his people. He finds the people that he can organize. And of course they can't outwardly organize against the Blacks because it wasn't acceptable to do that as blatantly. In the 70s, I feel like that was starting to die down. And so they had to find another topic. And all of that, and like what started me down that road was that documentary from Samantha Bee. It was only about 10 minutes. And when I finished watching, I thought, oh my goodness, I have so many questions. And so that was the first thing. Also, there was another documentary from PBS that talked about the history of religion in the US. There's a short clip where they interviewed Frank Schaeffer, who was the son of Francis Schaeffer, who was also one of the people involved in the Christian right movement, one of the main architects. I believe I think it was him that was quoted, but there was a segment where they talked about Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson were approached to become a part of the pro-life movement, and they both refused that, but didn't care. And I remember, if you think of like the record, like taking the record off, the needle off of a record, like that. When I watched it, I remember pausing the video and saying, "What? Wait."
Mm-hmm.
And I had a few times, and it turns out Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell really thought it was unseemly for Christians to be involved in politics, and really didn't care about Roe versus Wade passing. They said, well, I believe even Jerry Falwell issue. I'm interested in winning souls for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I thought, I was stunned. I said, the abortion, a given that if you are a conservative Christian, you are against abortion. I was born in 1978, and my entire life that has been a given. Mm-hmm. And to find out that wasn't so, even like a few years before I was born, I thought, well, now, that's insane. I feel like, no, what else am I missing, or what else do I not know? And that's what started me down that road. But yeah, I think the record scratch moment was that Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, two figures that I grew up seeing on TV, actually were not, we're not as adamantly against had led us to believe.
Yeah, I want to pause and acknowledge how massive that revelation is, because I felt the same exact way when I learned that fact too. It wasn't from that particular documentary. It was from a book. The sorts of primary, direct quotations from these people from the 70s are shocking, because they've been buried or forgotten, one or the other, depending on how magnanimous people.
I printed out the transcript of that video, by the way. I need this on paper.
Yeah.
That's how much that blew my mind.
Yeah, because it was the galvanizing thing. I was born a few years after you in 83, but it was the galvanizing political topic was abortion. And so to learn that was not the original issue. The original issue was that they wanted to keep on being racist and keep on utilizing their tax exempt status and keep being racist. That is a big shocker for people that grew up in our sorts of communities, because that is absolutely not what was told. So for folks to learn that the Southern Baptist Convention applauded Roe v. Wade when it was first announced. When you learn that Jerry Falwell, one of the original architects of the religious right and the moral majority, did not care and only used it because it was politically viable to get people's blood boiling. For a moment, whenever you discover that.
Well, it seemed like he had to be talked into it. Mm-hmm. It seems, and it was strategic because he had already made a name for himself. He had started Liberty. It was Baptist College in the early 70s. And he had his old-timey preaching hour, old-timey gospel hour, mm-hmm. Whatever it was called. He had his, Thomas Road was, I don't know if it was a mega church this way. Mm-hmm. And so it was strategic to get him involved because he had that name recognition.
Yeah.
And he would be able to get people mobilized, which he did. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, I guess that part, but it seemed to me that there were meetings that happened where he was convinced to join. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, let's bring back Wyrick too, because he was the person that sort of connected these people, and he saw the potential for basically a voting bloc out of conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals, and making the issue abortion so that they could sidestep being seen as racist, and that it's for.
And also in Randall Barma, I think you've had him on your show. There's a quote in one of his books where Paul Weyrich told him directly they were strategizing over issues, and someone on the call said, "How?" I guess he related that story to Randall Balmer, the historian that writes about evangelical history. So that's the other thing that kind of stood out. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't as simple. I'm sure there were a lot of other conversations, but literally they were brainstorming. Well, what should we do? Well, what about abortion? For sure.
Yeah. So this is all happening in the late 70s, but then all these things continue to build upon one another until we get to a pretty critical year, which is 19. A lot of things happen in 1980 that really get the ball rolling. And you've done some research into why that year was so pivotal for the movement that would culminate in the storming of the frickin' Capitol of the United States. So what was it about the things that happened in 1980 that kicked off so many different developments that had such a big impact in our own individual lives as well as a whole?
Well, that was the year we got Reagan, we elected Reagan. But before that, there were three cumulative events that I think the previous years have been building up to. Was in the spring, was the Washington for Jesus rally on the National Mall in DC. Then there was, in the summer, the White House Conference on Families, which in and of itself, I mean, that entire book in itself, it was sort of, I think, one of the last sort of big events that Jimmy Carter's administration had put on. And then finally in August, there's briefing, which also attachment. Oh, sorry, that was Dallas. I keep getting it. That was in Dallas. The Washington for Jesus rally was in DC. The White House Conference for Families was in three major cities, Minneapolis, and I believe LA. And then the National Affairs gathering and the National Affairs briefing was in Dallas, Texas. And so there was one that was more gathering of people, sort of performative religion, that's what I like to call it. And the other two were much more focused, seemed to be much more focused on policy. And I think I wouldn't say they blame for why we have terrible policies now, but the more I read about what people were advocating for, I said, oh, this is setting the groundwork for terrible policies.
So let's start with the Washington for Jesus performative religion at that event.
Well, the interesting thing about that was the more I was reading about it and watching footage, it was actually somewhat diverse. It was it came from the vision of a Puerto Rican man who was from New York. An interesting thing I noticed about the media coverage of him is former drug addict and I think gang leader or something like that. That was always mentioned. But he was a minister. I believe he had started his own church in Virginia Beach, which is the headquarters of Christian Broadcasting Network and the flagship program 700 Club. And he had a relationship with Pat Robertson. And so his name was John Jimenez, and this was his vision, basically, to have this rally in DC next to the Capitol. And basically, like a performative, I mean, I'm sure I know they didn't call it that, but a performative religion rally. The specific date that they had it on, I believe, was April 29th or April 20th. And they chose that day specifically because that was the day, this is how they put it, the settlers erected a cross in Jamestown. I'm from Williamsburg, Virginia. Speaking of, whitewashing history, and that's a whole other issue, but I grew up very close to Jamestown, and they picked that date because on that day, the settlers had landed and they had erected this cross and proclaimed Jamestown for Jesus, proclaimed that land for Jesus. And so that's why they held it on that day. It was well attended, and because I've talked about this in a thread, and I hesitated at first with comparing this to the insurrection, because by all means, if you looked at it, if you were just watching something with no sound, you saw a rally or you saw a church. But then if you listen to the words, there was a whole day of events. There was preacher after preacher, all men. They had a little event for the ladies the day before, the women's event.
Of course.
The main event, it was preacher after preacher, and I saw some racial diversity among the preachers. When I saw footage of the crowd, there seemed to be a diverse crowd there.
Mm-hmm.
And there seemed to be sort of this light-hearted feeling, but they were there. They were there for a purpose. They one of the things attendees were encouraged to do were to visit their Congress people, their members of Congress for, do they call them lobby visits? There was also some kind of document or manifesto with all these different writings about different policy that was leaked to the press that caused a lot of controversy, because then people were saying, well, this is political, which of course the rally promoter said, no, this isn't political. This is about Jesus, which again, sounds familiar.
Yeah.
So that was quickly scrapped, but there were attendees were encouraged to visit their Congress people and pray with them.
Mm-hmm.
There is a significant moment with, I don't know when during the rally it happened, but there's an account that a woman was talking about the pastor, the preacher had paused in his sermon and wanted everyone to lift their hands toward the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
So that gesture, like lifting your hands toward
something to
bless something. But of course, it wasn't to bless them. It was to, I would say, in my opinion, to condemn them. But I know they wouldn't say that. They were encouraged. Attendees were encouraged towards the Capitol to let them know that they were reclaiming this space for God.
Mm-hmm.
And they needed to turn back to Christ. That was very clear.
That's very familiar.
Yeah.
And I think we've even seen some clips of very similar language on the 6th. So there is a degree of continuity there.
Holding the Christian flag.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it does. When I hope actually flag, that immediately made me think of that woman's comment. Where she was describing the preacher having them hold their hands, and this is the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
That they were inside the Capitol this time.
Yeah, I mean that language and even the way in which American history is recast and a false narrative is told around it that Christianizes it. I went to a Christian college, and my history professor taught and really valorized people like the Pilgrims and all these things because of the Christianization of it. That all rings very, very consistent within this subculture. What happened at the conference on families, the White House conference on families? What contributed to 1980?
And one more thing about the rally is that was the first event, and it actually didn't get a ton of media coverage.
Oh, okay.
And again, this might sound familiar, but the media, I think, Carter had announced himself as born again. The media kind of didn't know what to do. So what are they like? It seemed like there were a lot of through the late 70s up until then, who are these Christians? What do they want? What are they doing? And I think so there was still sort of that, not that they were unknown, all these people have been on the news, but the rally didn't get, but out of all the three, the rally didn't really get a ton of media coverage.
Mm-hmm.
Clinton was not there because he was on his own tour called the I Love America tour, which, I mean, of course he was. But yeah, so I just wanted to say that last bit about the rally. But the White House conference was sort of this event that had been in the works. I think it was originally supposed to happen maybe a couple of years before, but there were all these delays. This is kind of when the women really started to shine. And side note, if you have a chance, I would highly recommend watching that Mrs. America about Phyllis Schlafly. It as about feminism, but I'm going to say bluntly now it's about white feminism. It was very clear. But having said that, I would highly recommend it, particularly for the portrayal of Phyllis Schlafly, which was dead on. The kinds of things that they talked about. When I was watching it, all of the things I had read about, all the characters I had read about were suddenly in front of me on the screen. Because she was also instrumental in being was also talked into joining as well, but that's also another story. So the White House Conference on Families started out that they had delegations. Was allotted a number of delegations of delegates. And they would go to the conference, and it was 3 days where they talked about to families. They went to breakout groups, and they passed resolutions. Now, even with all my experience working for mainline denominations, I do know a little bit about bureaucracy and forming committees and task force, but to be honest, when I read about this, it seemed so complex, the time that went into getting these delegates. But essentially, conservative Christian right was intentional about getting their own people nominated or in as delegates, so they could send them to the conferences. And conferences happened, it's kind of derailed from there. There were the accounts, and here's the thing: the accounts were one-sided, but that was also purposeful. I read most of the accounts. The first-hand accounts I read were from the Christian women who went, and the theme throughout was that they wanted to make heard and make sure the topics that were important to them, abortion, being homophobic, and I think it was education, abortion being the big. They wanted to make sure that those items were front and center. Sorry, I mean, I know I say homophobic, but the way they said it was they were objecting to homosexual rights. Is how they put it. And it was the 70s, right. So those were the terms that were used. Or sorry, it was 1980, but it was still, those were the terms that were used. And so in each session, the accounts were very similar. They would try to dominate the session, issues. They scoffed at topics like universal daycare, housing assistance for poor families, really anything that had to do with uplifting working class families. They painted that as government interference, or the government solving problems. They kind of derailed things up until a point where it was the second day, I believe, they decided to stage a dramatic walkout because they believed that their voices weren't being heard and they were being
familiar.
Yes. And I mean, it was really kind of eerie reading all of this. I said, "Oh my goodness, this is insane." But they staged a walkout, and it was basically. I don't know what I know that they plan to disrupt things, but I'm not sure in terms of their what their overall goal with that was. But it did what they meant it to do. It did disrupt things. But coincidentally, once a bunch of them staged a walkout, at the end when people voted on resolutions, guess which resolutions passed? The progressive ones, because the conservative women, they walked out. So to me, that was kind of fascinating. I want to bring up one particular name who was very instrumental. Her name was Connie Marshner. I believe she worked for the Young Americans for Freedom. I believe she was originally working with them, but she was one of the few women whose name I saw mentioned with almost as much frequency as Phyllis. She eventually went on to work with the Moral Majority. I believe she attained the leadership position there, but she was one of the people kind of instrumental in that, in the organizing all of that with the White House Conference on Families. One other thing about that event, the drama even leading up to the conference really surrounded the name as well. The White House Conference on the Family versus Conference on Families. So the second one, in the view of me and the Christian right, meant there were multiple kinds of families, to which of course they objected to. And so there was a long fight that dragged out even over the name, calling it families, saying, well, there's only one nuclear family. That shouldn't be called the White House Conference on Families. And again, anyone who's worked in any kind of church committee, those kind of arguments can drag out for a long time.
Yeah.
But I thought that was really fascinating. Just that alone, just objecting to something as small as the name, and they eventually lost.
But that does encapsulate where their own presumptions or where they lie.
It put them on the map. And I do want to say, and the reason I mentioned that as one of the key events is I feel like it put them on the map. Especially, it got the attention of the media, the walkout, which honestly was probably one of the motivators. But that's really, it seemed like people were really paying attention then. Because even just contrasting the news coverage between that and the Washington for Jesus event, I felt to find a lot more articles, a lot more write-ups about that. Now, granted, it was a longer event and it was put on by the White House, but I do think that was significant because, now they got people's attention, and even in their established them as a group that was formidable.
It was a successful publicity stunt in that respect.
Yes. And I don't want this to get lost in all of it, but, going back to the policies that were talked about that were scoffed at by the Christian right were policies that would have helped particularly people of color. And I think that's very important to note in terms of, how we got here. It's really important to understand and I'm not solely placing the blame on the Christian right, but it's really important to understand how instrumental the Christian right is in contributing to the fact that we have that daycare is so expensive and not quality daycare is not easily accessible to all families, that housing isn't easily accessible, that public transportation isn't easily accessible. There's a reason for that, and the Christian right is very much a part of that reason.
Yes, definitely. And that the fact that it was present and this all happened 40 years ago, and we're still sort of fighting the same, moved on to another thing. That's one of that is the fact that the Christian right has been so successful in guiding the conservative party.
And in case there's anyone, because I'm thinking of the objections that pop up, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the 1619 Project, which that's a whole other, which is why we now have the 1776 Commission. But the 1619 Project from the New York Times, I read it last year and used it in one of my classes. That actually details, from the time of slavery up until now, the impact of racism in basically, all infrastructure. So again, like I say, the Christian right, we can point to them for a lot of terrible policies, but I do want to acknowledge that those things started, long before it. I think that their role in it made it easier, but just because I don't know, if I was sitting listening to this and that the 1619 Project and the research that was done with that, if that wasn't mentioned, I think that
right.
Yeah, I just, and overall, I don't want to make it sound like all started in the 70s, which we all know, but I just want to reiterate, this started from slavery.
Yes, absolutely. The Christian right is just the historical continuity of those things, and modern and contemporary expression of these things that have been present in America since its founding. Absolutely. I 100% agree there. There's one other event that we talked about before we actually started recording, as all these, and that can help highlight just how long we've been dealing with this stuff with the Christian right. And that final event is the National Affairs Briefing. So what happened at that event that continues still be present in conservative Christian politics here in the States?
So that was really the solidifying of mobilization of people. It was put on by this entity called the Religious. And from what I understand, that itself was somewhat short-lived. It was headed by a businessman. I never know how to pronounce his name. Megatier, I think was his name. This in August. So now we're up to 3 months before the election. And in the years leading up to that, Paul Weyrich and his were having all these series of meetings where they were coming up with strategies. Once they had their outraged group of people to rile up, they strategies to get people mobilized. The moral majority was instrumental in that. That actually came from a phrase, I think Paul Weyrich said to Jerry Falwell. It was coined between the two of them in a casual conversation. By the time the National Affairs Briefing had come around, they had enough high-profile ministers on board that were able to reach out to other ministers and invite them to this briefing. And it was really kind of it was like lobbying training or grassroots training. It was 2 days of, again, similar to the Conference on Families. There were all these different sessions and seminars and things like that. There was also a great deal of preaching. And they were giving all these ministers a crash course in organizing 101. How to mobilize their congregations, how to start voter registration drives. That is, as the local races were really where the Christian right spread a lot of their influence. And so they had all these ministers that were basically, it was briefings. They were on different policy issues that were, quote, important, and that they would then pass on to their congregations and to their communities.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I understand, both Reagan and Carter were invited. From the reports I read, Carter's people were a little concerned to be associated, rightly so, in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
to show up at an event. But Reagan, of course, was like gung-ho to be there. And I want to pause too, because I was 2 years old when all this happened. So, of course, I had no understanding of who the president was or who people were outside my family. But it's interesting to read it now. We had a guy who was a moderate, who had ties to Hollywood, who at one point actually,
Mm-hmm.
he actually, as governor of California, signed into law the repeal of an abortion ban,
Mm-hmm.
or made abortion illegal, or made abortion legal. Who went from that to courting these conservative Christian leaders, and all of a sudden finding Jesus.
Mm-hmm. All
of a sudden he prayed a lot. He literally said at the briefing, "The Bible is my favorite book." That sounds familiar. That Christians said, finally, there's someone godly is going to be in the office.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we had another guy, Jimmy Carter, who was a Sunday school teacher, who called himself a born. He's the reason the media even knows about the word born again Christian,
mm-hmm.
And talked about his faith all the time in interviews. But Reagan, the guy who did not have a religious background, was the one that was more godly.
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, all of that, I know it sounds almost too eerie to talk about. Remember, we had a guy who was part, Obama, who was a part of a church. His pastor kind of made some headlines at some point. A guy who literally sang a gospel song.
Yep.
At an event. Trump was the more godly person. So the similarities are so incredibly, again, I don't know the word, but eerie, strange. But yeah, like I just want to, it seemed like there was a very similar sort of procession events that, seemed very, very familiar to me. So at the National Fair, Reagan was, I believe, the keynote speaker. And he was very, very excited to be able to address them, and took numerous opportunities to tell them so. Before he went on stage, was one of the organizers of the event had suggested that he make some kind of statement about them not being able to endorse him because separation of church and state, but they can't endorse him, but he can endorse them. And so he comes out on stage, and at the end of his speech, he says, like, I know that you can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing, which of course became a soundbite. And it was replayed. It's seen from what I saw in the media coverage over and over. And if I remember correctly, maybe when I got older and I heard adults talking about that phrase being talked about when I was a kid in the 80s.
Yeah.
People saying that you can't endorse me, but I can endorse you. But I endorse you.
Right.
So, but I think that was basically, I don't know if that sealed Jimmy Carter's fate. I think there's a lot of people, a lot of scholars that have different interpretations, but it seems like I think it definitely didn't hurt, because then we know 3 months later, went on to win the election by a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I think those three, and it seemed also was interesting kind of how they built on each other. And like I had said about the conference and family sort of solidified them as a force, the national affairs briefing really did. That's where it was shown, oh, these people have influence. These people should not be overlooked. These people have power and influence, and we should we're to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very important also to note at no point in any of these was there anything blatantly racist. There's no ranting against those people. There is no, lamenting about Black people knowing their place and things like that. And it's important because we all know about the Southern strategy and how that started even before then. But it's really important to note that with these three events, the things they were doing had incredibly racist implications.
Mm-hmm.
Racism,
mm-hmm.
but it didn't come up. So I think that's the most important thing, and because I think that's what defined my own experience growing up around them. Growing up, I didn't see racist people. I wasn't called the N-word all the time. I wasn't. I was friends with many of their kids. I stayed over at sleepovers at their homes. Many of them treated me like their own daughter. Granted, would not have hesitated for policies that would screw me over. But I think that reading about that event and reading about how those things played out helped me kind of make sense of my own upbringing, and sort of how it fit in, and how I think also can lead to eventually some of the surprise when we started seeing all these Klan members come out of the woodwork, Nazis and all of this, and led to this isn't who we are. The Christian right did an incredibly good job of burying itself in dog whistles.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it was always right there under the surface. I'm not saying I understand, but I think it is understandable that people were surprised at what racism in our country. It was there. It was those people were there. The Christian right leaders tried to pretend they weren't. They tried to sort of keep their distance, but those folks were always there.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to because I wanted to kind of tie it together, and also just use my own experience.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. In that similar vein, I also am always sort of motivated to try and look back at what we can see in history to try to understand how we get to our present moment and understand the sort of things that helped the society that I was brought up in, that I'm now, and many other people are trying to actively challenge and try and change either from inside or outside. From your own perspective, like knowing this history, that those things are there and everyone's sort of taken aback or surprised by things that happened just a month ago. Like, I think there's a level of emotional processing that a lot of people have to go through and be ready to investigate these things. And that is complicated and made harder if you're part of a marginalized group too.
Right.
It does feel like this is a moment we shouldn't just let pass by. Right. Within these communities, they should really, no more mulligans, no more passing it on to another generation. No, none of that. Now is the time you need to look at what's happened and reckon with how we. So in that respect, what are the sort of conversations that you think people need to be having on any sort of level, whether it's like the conversation that media should be trying to encourage, or those in between people on Facebook or Twitter? Where do you think, knowing all the things that led to the insurrection and everything that's happened since the 80s, what should be the next steps?
I've been thinking a lot about a while. I think even before I started the research, and even when I've been thinking about writing about this, or when I talk about it in social media, when I put up a flyer for Washington for Jesus, or if I put up video footage of a pastor at National Affairs briefing saying it's time out of the closet. Really happens. I think that a lot, like, what is, like, how am I contributing? What do I want people to take away from this? And at the most basic level, people should understand history. History always repeats itself. People should, but only that, they should understand the historical context. They should understand this isn't anything new. But in terms of what to do with that, I think I'm still kind of struggling. I think the bit most, but while I struggle, what I can do is just to keep sharing these things, keep talking. When I found out that Reagan's campaign slogan was "Let's make America great again," why is that not? How come no one knows? I keep seeing every now and then on social media, I'll see another person say, "Hey, did you all know this was a slogan?" But when I saw that, I said, "That's not true. That's not real." Someone made that. But Ronald Reagan's slogan was "Make America Great Again." That's. I feel like that's all I can do until I figure out how to move these conversations forward. Not to say that they can't be, but when Tom Cotton asinine op-ed about declaring martial law, I immediately thought of Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and the fact that it was a response to a bunch of white ministers, hey, calm down. And I actually, and basically I found I put up some of the quotes from their letter, talking about the need for peace and not having, jobs and things like that. Because again, I thought, we've been here before. Maybe Tom Cotton put it a little bit in a little bit more political speak than these men. Basically trying this, they were doing the same thing. It was about suppressing Black people. So I feel like those are the things that I can contribute. I can inform people. I can show them as the Christian right in their own words. There's plenty of books that have been written. There's plenty of scholars that have studied this. There's plenty that you can read about it. But the more I do the research, the more I think they should speak for themselves. I think that, people should hear the rhetoric, the things that they said, the way they tried to justify their actions. And that can contribute to, the conversation moving forward. I mean, because I know there's work that's already being done. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. I honestly, again, I do struggle with this a lot. But I also think it's important to share my own experiences too. When we talk about violence and elevated violence within the Christian right, and the America First, and sort of the session with the military. I went to a Southern Baptist school. I don't even know if I mentioned this, but I went to a Southern Baptist school for 4 years, which was probably, besides being a missionary kid overseas, was one of the more defining experiences of my life.
Yeah.
Being one of two students in an entire high school of about 150, 200 people. That's a whole book, probably, or miniseries. But I remember the Gulf War. First time President Bush invaded Iraq, President Bush invaded Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
One of the teachers, he ended up being my science teacher later. Let's see, when was the Gulf War?
Yeah, 91st.
Okay, so I was in 7th grade. This was spring of 7th grade. So he was my science teacher. Was in the reserves and was I don't know to, but we had a send off for him, and because I remember the 5th and 6th graders. This was a K through 12 school.
Mm-hmm.
The 5th and 6th graders sang in a chorus, "I'm proud to be American," American flags. And I say that because I remember everyone being shocked at that photo that circulated. When was it? It seems like it was 100 years ago, at a Baptist church where there's a huge American flag
mm-hmm.
behind it. And everyone said, and I remember thinking, well, of course there's an American flag in the church.
Yeah.
Right. That was part of our send out. They sang, "I'm proud to be an American." The year before, when we had our spring concert, I was in 6th grade. The songs that I don't remember all the other songs we sang, but we sang the theme songs for the 4 branches of military.
Mm.
I know the words: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines.
Yeah.
Our music teacher, plucking away at the piano. I remember everything. I remember the chords. We sang that in a concert for our school. We weren't given an explanation why.
Right.
But, so those kinds of things, when I would see these things, these images pop up, when I would see people reacting, I'd say, oh yeah, when I saw the Christian flag, I think maybe, did you and I or something, I had a conversation with someone about this. When they kept showing the image of the Christian flag in the Capitol.
Yeah.
That was funny because some people said that no, there's Christian flag, said, oh, I to it every day in class. The American flag, the Christian flag, and the Bible.
Yeah.
I could also recite those pledges.
Yeah.
When I see these things, it's important. It reminds me the things that I took as normal as a kid. Now we're not. And the way those things shaped me, but also for me, again, it's a matter of I can tell people about it. I can tell people, I know you think this is unusual, but this was something I saw all the time as a kid. These were things I heard in sermons. These were things I heard from the adults in the community. These are not new sentiments.
Right.
These are on brand. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I feel like for now, just telling stories. And again, it goes back to what I said in the beginning with ex-evangelicals. Black folks, we talk a lot, especially on social media, white people gathering your people.
Yeah.
When something racist happens, but honestly, I feel like that's the best example.
Yeah.
That I see. Like this is what I mean. And seeing all these folks say, seeing all these folks say, these things are real and I experienced them. I think that's really important.
Right.
And I hope that the media also pays attention. I know there's a few religion reporters that do understand. Those are the people that need to be interviewed. The people that are interviewed should be should be much more diverse. But in terms of, when they write these articles about the Christian right and Christian nationalism, and they quote the same 5 leaders, they who happen to be like a broken clock, right about Trump being terrible, but nothing else. These are the people they need to hear. So at the end, I think telling stories, telling people about experiences, showing them historical events, I think is on the way. And I mean, I think, podcasts like yours, are doing that. You're podcasts that break down these beliefs, that talk about this is what evangelicals believe, this is what I experience. If that makes sense.
I think that's right on. And perspective, I really enjoyed just hearing all the different elements of your research and the way in which your personal life informs it. And I do think that is something that, regardless of whether someone uses the term evangelical to describe themselves, I think there's a lot of value in hearing from people like yourself who've lived through these things, have these perspectives, and have also begun to do really interesting and important research into it. And I hope that our and sharing it through the podcast will allow people to be able to understand their own experience a little better. Maybe if they don't have the backgrounds that we do, they'll be able to understand from the outside too. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me nerd out a little bit.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I've been knee deep in all this for so long. And I mean, I could probably fill hours and hours just, talking about 1980 alone. But I appreciate someone, because I feel like I've also talked a lot with people who didn't grow up in this experience. And so they understand and they can empathize, but it's great to talk. And no, you probably won't be quite as shocked, I guess. People I talk to, and that is not warranted or understandable, but yeah.
Well, where can people find you online, Laura? Where can they find your threads that you've mentioned, as well as places to support your work like Patreon?
You can find me on Twitter at C. And actually, there's a link where in my profile that links to my Patreon, PayPal, and Cash App. If you like support me there in my constant underemployment. Things that I've written. And I actually am going to try to find a hub for all of the threads that I wrote. Patreon is also CLola Go. And I'll say this now so it'll motivate me to get on it. But I am working on developing resources for people who teach religious studies or teach classes, particularly on American Christianity. And I'm making that available to folks. So yeah, that's where you can find me, Patreon and Twitter.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today, Laura.
Of course. Thank you.